This is Intimacy Part 5. We've already discussed a lot about intimacy and relationships, but we're going to shift Part 5 into parents, siblings, and family. So we've discussed the importance of intimacy with friends and peer groups, and we know that in childhood, children share and have emotional closeness with their parents, mainly because that's who they're exposed to the most. And other family members as well. But intimacy starts to shift in adolescence, as we've already talked about, and it's a particular shift with family. So I think it's important to note, and your author does well to do this, that when we talk about like intimacy with parents and intimacy with peers, it's not to say that new targets of intimacy replace old ones, but rather new targets are added on to old ones. So you still have intimacy with your parents, family members. You also have intimacy with your peers, and then eventually we're going to talk about dating, and you have intimacy there as well. So it's not like one replaces the other, it just kind of keeps accumulating. Okay, intimacy between adolescents and their parents can be quite complicated. We start to see a decline in intimacy around 5th grade, and that decline continues until 10th grade, when it is at its lowest. However, the good news is that in 10th grade, we start to see an increase that continues all the way up into young adulthood. We already know that intimacy with friends looks much different. It's a continuous steady increase all throughout adolescence. It's also described as much less stressful than relationships with parents, but we've already talked about that with our family module, so I'm not going to really get into that too much. But I can say with certainty, anecdotally, that at the time of this recording, I have a 5th grader, and I'm trying to talk to him about relationships and pure relationships, right? Like, and maybe even like romantic interests, and he wants nothing to do with that. So it's actually kind of humorous that this was the part that I was reading literally about 10 minutes after I had a conversation with my now 5th grader about like crushes and who has crushes on who and who his crush is and everything, and he was like, shut off. He did not want to talk about it with me. So it makes sense. Okay, the only time that we're really going to pit intimacy with parents and intimacy with peers is kind of what we just did. We're not really going to do that again. The reason is because it's not really fair, nor is it valid when we look at the research. So when we study intimacy, this is not a valid way to study it. When making comparisons, it's much, much better to compare the haves and the have-nots. The haves, what I mean by this is like those who have a parent-oriented or a peer-oriented intimate relationship. Both, by the way. They have social support from both family and friends. And the have-nots are those who don't have either. So these adolescents, obviously, and the have-nots tend to be sensitive to rejection, less likely to engage when invited, when they even get an invite to anything with another person or a group of people. This loneliness really is associated with a vast array of negative psychological and physical outcomes. I'm not really going to get in too much into that since we've talked about this in depth a lot already in our class. This section for me, I don't know about you, but this section for me seemed a little bit redundant. So I'm kind of going to gloss over that. Okay, let's talk about intimacy with parents in particular. Back to parents. Adolescents will model behaviors that they see their parents and that their parents do, and especially in a parent's marital relationship, they will model behaviors in their own romantic relationships. So this includes things like how they deal with conflict, how they express emotion, how they receive emotion, all of those things. And this is quite interesting because that research actually supports social learning theory, and it also supports attachment-based views of intimacy. So basically what I'm saying here is that children learn intimate behaviors very, very early on, and then these these things that they learn, like what they're seeing in terms of intimate relationships and behaviors, kind of provide a model or a template for the relationships that they themselves will form later on. So kind of cool. Another interesting aspect of the child parent or adolescent parent relationship involving intimacy is that while the likelihood of turning to friends in times of need increases throughout adolescence, the likelihood of turning to a parent pretty much stays the same. So parents are kind of always there for their kids, and they will be. Let's talk about arguments, though, and disagreements. Arguments are much more likely to happen with family than friends. These arguments are usually get more heated, much more anger. Adolescents are more likely to argue with mom than dad, something we've mentioned before in the family module. Adolescents also report that mom, even though they fight with her more, and I know we've already talked about this, but just a little bit of refresher in terms of intimacy. Mom is more understanding, more accepting, more willing to negotiate, less judgmental, less guarded, less defensive than dad. And these differences are much larger for girls with their mothers than boys with their mothers. Intimacy with parents is usually for a different reason, and we've talked about this in terms of like advice when you turn to your parent and when you turn to your friends. Well, it's kind of the same thing with intimacy. It's a different type of intimacy with a parent than it is with a friend. Like, you share, you know how I basically defined intimacy as emotional closeness. So you have a different type of emotional closeness with your parent than you do your friend. But when it comes to parents, it's much more like guidance on larger issues. You know, we've talked about all of this before. The interesting thing is that when you look at, and I know I said I wasn't going to pit friends and parents, but I kind of am right now. When you look at intimacy with friends, you're sharing things with somebody that is the same age as you, that has the same context as you, like maybe goes to the same school, has the same friend groups, whatever. And so they might even be going through the exact same thing, and it's much easier for them to kind of understand. However, they don't have the wisdom and the knowledge to kind of understand, so they're not quite an expert in the field as a parent might be. Okay, back to this. Having a family support, we are on support. Having a family support system, it's pretty important in adolescence, especially for those who don't have a lot of friends. However, family support does not fully compensate for the lack of peer support, and vice versa. You know, a lot of friends doesn't necessarily compensate for not a lot of family support. And this is very, very important. Family relationships and peer relationships, they influence one another. They don't compete with one another. And again, that goes back to me telling you that I'm not putting these relationships up against each other, because it's more of like a, how do I want to say this? You remember when I don't actually know. I think this might have been my other class. I know for sure in the Psychology of Adolescence, my Psychology 291, when we talk about nature and nurture, we don't talk about nature versus nurture. We talk about how nature influences nurture and how nurture influences nature. That's a developmental approach to it, and that's really what we're talking about here with peer relationships and parent relationships, especially in terms of intimacy. They really do influence one another, but they don't necessarily compete with one another. In terms of other family, the research is kind of, there's just not a lot of it, I guess is how I want to say that. I do have some emojis on the screen because it was the only way I could kind of convey how I was interpreting these results. Generally speaking, and I know a lot of you are going to disagree with this, and you're going to write about it in your 10 things in your module assessment, but generally speaking, adolescents say that they are less intimate with their siblings than with their parents or their friends. I know. But variability, you guys. I know that I've said that over and over and over, but this is so true. Early adolescence seems to be the absolute lowest for positive sibling relationships. Adolescents will fight a lot with their siblings, much more than their friends, and it's usually only resolved with parental intervention. Sibling conflict does decrease over the span of adolescence, but that might just be because you're spending less and less time with your sibling, and therefore there's less opportunity to even have conflict. while intimacy may be there with other extended family members, particularly your author talks a lot about grandparents, unfortunately in adolescence we see a very dramatic drop off in intimacy with extended family members, even though there are so many psychological benefits for both grandparent and adolescent to maintain a close relationship. And keep in mind that this is not the case with all adolescents, especially those who have single divorced mothers or those who live with their grandparents. Okay, that's going to conclude this video.